Sorry for that double tap. Welcome everyone to this evening's Planning and Zoning Commission, February 18th, 2021. I'd like to call this commission to order. And first off, and most importantly, I'd like to welcome our two new commissioners, Commissioner Josephine Wakeman and Commissioner Brad Schaefer. Happy to have a full house and appreciate you joining us tonight. We'll start off tonight's meeting. I will read an opening statement. The Planning and Zoning Commission is composed of Peoria citizens who have been appointed by the City Council to serve on the Commission as a civic responsibility without compensation. Our duty is to study and review planning and zoning issues within the City of Peoria. The Commission holds public hearings or may conduct a study session on a topic. Decisions made by the Commission on general plan amendments, rezonings, and text amendments are forwarded as written recommendations to the City Council. The City Council will consider the recommendation of the Commission and make the final determination. The City Council may concur with the decision, modify it, overturn it, or remand it back to the Commission for further consideration. For conditional use permit applications, the Planning and Zoning Commission will act as the determining body and may approve or deny or continue the application. Any member of the public may appeal the decision of the Commission to the City Council regarding a conditional use permit. The appeal must be submitted in writing to the Planning and Community Development Department within 15 calendar days of the date of the Commission's decision. As Arizona and Peoria continue to be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, tonight's meeting is being conducted using measures to protect the health and safety of the public while discussions, deliberations, and actions of the Planning and Zoning Commission remain transparent. To ensure the health and safety of those attending tonight's meetings, members of the public are required to wear facial coverings and social distance while inside the City Council chambers. Members of the public who wish to watch the meeting remotely may do so by viewing a live stream broadcast on Facebook at facebook.com/City of Peoria AZ, as well as on the Digital Peoria channel on YouTube. The meeting is also broadcast on Cox Channel 11 and CenturyLink Channel 8509. Additionally, the posted agenda online invited citizens with comments or questions on any agenda item to submit those by 6 p.m. in advance of the meeting. If you have comments or questions following tonight's meeting, you may submit those to the Planning Department by emailing planning@peoriaaz.gov. In the interest of maintaining a fair and efficient hearing, the Commission will adhere to the following steps during tonight's meeting. Each case will be called in the order in which it appears on the agenda unless otherwise announced. Chair will open the case. The City will then provide a brief report and recommendation. The applicant is then invited to give a presentation. Then the Chair will read the submitted testimony provided by the public in advance of the meeting. After all the testimony has been taken, we will invite the applicant back up to provide any rebuttal or final statements. Finally, we'll have a Commission discussion and decision. That concludes our opening statement. Let's begin tonight with a roll call. Commissioners, please indicate your presence after I call your name. Commissioner Tony Fighter.
Present.
Commissioner Linda Grice.
Present.
Commissioner Sean Hutchinson.
Present.
Commissioner Jeff Nelson.
Present.
Commissioner Brad Schaefer.
Present.
And Commissioner Josephine Wakeman.
Present.
And Chair is present. This is the final call for speaker request forms. If you'd like to address the Commission tonight, please fill out a speaker request form. We have them available up here, just out and outside the entrance chambers and at the podium. Next is consent agenda. The consent agenda is for items that are routine in nature. There is one item on the consent agenda, 1C. Minutes, discussion, and possible action to approve the minutes of the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting held on January 21, 2021. Do we have any questions or comments on consent agendas before us tonight? Do I have a motion?
Chairman, I move we approve consent agenda as presented.
I'll second.
Please cast your vote. And motion passes unanimously. We have two items on the regular agenda tonight. Item 2R Study session, mobile food vendor text amendment, staff presentation and possible discussion regarding a city-initiated amendment to sections 21-202, 21-503, and 21-505 of the zoning ordinance. This item is for discussion only. No action will be taken at this time. Following this item, we will move to 3R, recreational marijuana proposition 207 text amendment. Discussion and possible action to consider a city-initiated text amendment to sections 21-202, 21-203, 21-505, and 21-809 of the zoning ordinance. Staff, do you have, do we have any questions or comments from the commission on these?
Oh, Mr. Chair, I think we'll start with we need to start with the presentation for the first item.
My mistake. Thank you.
Chairman, members of the commission, Lori Deaver, planning manager for the department. I'd like to make a few opening remarks, in particular for this one before Rick gets into his presentation, just by the way of background, if you will. So one of the roles and responsibilities of mayor and city council is to provide governance and guidance to the community. So more specifically, they are acting as a legislative authority for the city, and as such, they are charged with providing policy direction to staff, leadership, et cetera, on a number of items. So as the city was looking to review and possibly update a number of possible regulations with regard to property maintenance and development standards, the mayor and city council established a council subcommittee in which they were charged with guiding staff in helping to establish direction or policy direction, if you will, on those specific items. So in particular, the subcommittee, which is typically comprised of 2 council members, would review the city code with leadership, with the city attorney's office and departmental staff first to determine if there was the need for an administrative change to the code or policy, and then to provide direction or guidance on how to formulate those changes. And 2 key aspects that they, in particular, were looking at was enforceability, but also impact to the community as a whole with those changes. And so one of the topics that was taken up by the subcommittee was mobile food vendors, or as we know it, food trucks, if you will. And the objective in doing so was to help staff create a zoning ordinance, a text amendment, if you will, to both respond to the new state regulations, also to streamline city requirements associated with these, and to balance the needs of the community, both from the residents' perspective, from the restaurant owners' perspective, the bricks and sticks, if you will, and from the food truck operators. So there's a number of stakeholders involved, and it's a community-wide discussion, and so they thought they would provide guidance to staff on this particular one. So with that said, what I do want to mention is feedback from the Planning and Zoning Commission is still important on this particular matter, and so we are before you this evening. So Rick's presentation this evening here is to provide an overview of the regulatory changes that are associated with food trucks, if you will, to go over benchmarking results, and to present our methodology in how we started to draft and formulate this upcoming text amendment that you will see. So tonight is a study session, and Rick's going to go into his presentation, and with that, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Lori. Commissioner or Chairman Alsop, members of the commission, it's a pleasure to be here this evening and talk to you a little bit about mobile food vendors. Now, I think before we move forward, we might want to reflect just a little in the past. The mobile food trucks have been around for many, many years. But clearly over the last, say, 4 to 6 years, the prominence of them has really started to take off, with some of them being, really big business and very good establishments that provide a very good product. However, when you looked at it from an overall standpoint, there really was not a blanket set of guidelines, from a state level a national level. Any regulations that you found always came from a state level. So you can imagine, you know, even back as far as 2017, when parts of this officially started, you know, each municipality was actually, you know, addressing their own specific needs. And with that, you can imagine that each municipality would also have a different set of regulations. So when you looked at it from a totality standpoint and you looked at it valley-wide, there were many different variations in how cities were addressing mobile food vendors. So again, that brings us to where we are tonight. It's a city-initiated code. It's really affecting 3 specific sections of our zoning ordinance with respect to the definitions, the land use matrix, and the limitations on uses. The purpose of this is to comply with state regulations based on new requirements that have come down, and establish a general set of regulations for the mobile food vendors that really balances the needs of, you know, not only business but the operators themselves, as well as the city of Peoria. As I stated, everybody was doing, you know, different things. Each city and each municipality essentially had their own set of regulations that address mobile vendors, food vendors. That all changed with House Bill 2371. And it's kind of ironic that it was initially offered by a member of the House of Representatives who was actually from a district here in the city of Peoria. It was signed by the governor May 14th of 2018 and has now provided an established set of guidelines. But more than anything, it did a couple of different things. It created uniformity. You know, it established a statewide standard for mobile food vendors. And really what it outlined was what cities could and could not do, and provided a clear definition for the mobile food vendor. In response to that, the League of Arizona Cities and Towns developed a model ordinance working with not only the Food Vendors Association, other vendors that would be categorized in that neighborhood as well, but also based on the input from other cities, they were able to establish a really an ordinance that would apply across the board. So, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we move on. As I stated, one of the directives of it, it really kind of outlined what a city can do and what a city can't do. You know, as I stated before, each city was doing their own separate thing, and there was not uniformity, you know, any uniformity across the board, and we're going to talk about that a little more in a little bit. But more specifically, HB 2371 stated that, you know, a city can prohibit operations within a specific distance of a residential zoning district. Based on sufficient parking needs, it can prohibit operations based on the parking code, and it can restrict parking spaces, use, duration, and vehicle size as well for specific sites. It also specifically stated what a city cannot do, which is require special permits or required processes that other similar businesses within the city had not had to go through. You couldn't require separation from other commercial entities and establishments beyond specific fire and building codes and safety codes. You couldn't restrict the use of legal parking spaces, you know, unless a specific site was underparked. And you couldn't require from a city to city or from a municipality to municipality fire inspections or safety inspections. If it has been approved and inspected within, say, for example, the city of Glendale in the last 12 months, then that's good enough for the city of Peoria. We can't require additional inspections. So when we look at amending our ordinance, you know, we look at it in a couple of different ways. You know, obviously we look at what we're doing now. You know, we also take a look at and set goals and vision for what we want it to be, we want it to accomplish. But also we take into account the effects of the new ordinance and the changes that we make, on the stakeholders, not only from an internal city standpoint on the different departments, but obviously from an external standpoint as well, local established businesses, the mobile food vendors themselves. So it really is, a collaborative effort and a comprehensive look at where we're going. So as I said, most often we start with what we're doing now. And currently, the mobile food vendor would be classified under the temporary use permit through the city. Now, typically, a temporary use permit, really has to do more with outdoor sales. But currently, the mobile food truck is associated or lumped into that category. Typical maximum 30 days per event. Typical larger grand scales event. Temporary use permits are renewable 3 times a year, up to 90 days max. There are some exemptions from the TUP, but I think a better illustration are just some of the examples of the TUPs you see out there all the time. Christmas tree lot sales, carnivals, Halloween, pumpkin patches, Valentine's Day, more recently, the flower sales out in the Fry's parking lot, fireworks stands. Those make up the majority of the temporary use permits that we see within the city. So you can see that the mobile food vendor doesn't necessarily align with, the specifics of that requirement. One of the other things that we do is, as we're looking at what we want to achieve, and you have to keep in mind that we've already had, the House bill tells us what we can do and what we can't do. So we've already got a pretty good, direction on our destination here. Now it's the nuts and bolts of how we get there. So most often, a common occurrence here when you're amending an ordinance is to look at what other cities are doing. And as I stated previously, what we found was that there was a wide range of what other cities were doing in the valley with respect, to the House bill being approved and initiated. What we found was that most cities had some form of regulation in place for food trucks. There were certain cities, after the House bill had been initiated and approved, that essentially backed away from it and required only business licenses and let the state deal with it from that point on. There were other, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but Buckeye, for example, they required a temporary use permit if it were part of a special event. Every city across the board required owner authorization for any private parcel that was this business was being conducted on. Only 2 out of the 10 that we looked at were requiring state licensing on the food inspections. And only Gilbert and Phoenix, had time restrictions on how long they could stay in the site. With respect to hours of operations, as I stated, 8 out of 10 cities had no limits, on how long a mobile food vendor could stay in one location. Which, brings up an obvious question. If it's staying in one place all the time, it's no longer a mobile food vendor. So you have to take that into account as well. We found, less than half of the cities in the valley restricted, ancillary uses, limits on tables and chairs and canopies. And only, again, 4 out of 11 were requiring dust-proof, dust-free surfaces, which, has county ramifications to it. So as I stated, the Arizona League of Cities, when this bill came out, created a model ordinance. And they had some recommendations in there, and I'd just like to touch on those if we could. And it recommended the traditional business license or, simple permit to be acquired by the vendor. From a private property standpoint, excuse me, they were recommending that, from a hours of operation standpoint, 6 hours in a 24-hour period seemed reasonable. That gave you the ability to capture a breakfast or lunch or a dinner crowd, but not park there at, 10 o'clock in the morning and stay till 8 o'clock at night and get them both. They did give the option to establish 96-hour time limits with, some exceptions, and also limit the legal parking spaces, and particularly, no exclusive right on any specific location. And they required a dust-proof surface, essentially for the business to be conducted on. International Fire Code, city towns inspections. Another good one, 15-gallon trash can receptacles, within a specific limit of the, the customer and the employees for rubbish. Keeping the area clean around, the site with, no debris and free, no clutter. Meeting the city or town's noise ordinance. Restricting it to commercial properties, retail properties, and maintaining a 250-foot separation from residential districts. And from a service standpoint, keeping the service windows away from, main arterials, but also more specifically, pedestrian walkways, site visibilities, parking aisles, drive aisles, ingress and egress points into, the site. So, their ordinance, was fairly clear in what you can and what you can't do, but left some flexibility in how you enforce that, and the regulations you apply to ensure that. As Lori had stated, it's been a very collaborative effort, and when I say collaborative, I mean a very large group of people. Under the guidance of the council subcommittee, they provided basic information in certain areas, and they talked about duration of hours on the site, with respect to 6 hours and being able to capture, specific crowds, and yet still being a mobile, food vendor. Provided clear direction with respect to, site and locational requirements, and examples of that are, requirements for, private property versus, public property, City of Peoria property. Setback requirements, not only from residential developments, but, from streets, and maintaining those walkways and those site visibility triangles as we talked about. Being associated with a principal permitted use on the site versus just a vacant dirt, undeveloped lot. And keeping the site original and restoring it back to original condition when you leave the site from that. Those are all examples of site location requirements, guidance that the subcouncil was providing. From an operational standpoint, we talked about hours of operation, but site orientation as well as, where the service window is. Making sure that we have free and clear travel and we're not blocking any of the, again, pedestrian walkways, the drive aisles, and the critical points of the circulation around and through a site. And again, meeting the noise ordinance. With respect to multi-departmental work, it really was a collaborative effort, and I would just state that not only is it continuing on and it's ongoing, but just to give you an example, we're talking about the planning department, the police department, code enforcement department, economic development, traffic, building safety. There have been, ongoing meetings and updated meetings as we've gone through this process. As we get guidance and direction from the council subcommittee, then we would take it and filter it in, to the other departments. Another, huge portion of this is the stakeholders, that are out there, not only the existing, brick and mortar businesses that are there, but also the mobile food vendors themselves. We've worked extensively with the economic development teams to reach out and create extensive mailing lists. We've tried very hard to keep these vendors and anyone that really wish to get involved and have information regarding this involved in the process. We have a stakeholder open house that's coming a week, Tuesday, the 23rd, I believe it is. We have encouraged and sent those out. We've posted the ordinance on our website. We have directed them there to be able to sign up for the stakeholder meeting on Tuesday. And we've encouraged them to plug into this meeting tonight, not only in person, but on, via the internet, to be able to stay up to date with what's going on and again, understand the process that we've undertaken and the steps in which have brought us here tonight. And finally, it brings us to the study session this evening in front of y'all. And just to give you a couple of the next steps, I've already talked about the stakeholders, but we're tentatively scheduled for March 18th to bring this to you for formal consideration. And we're targeting a city council for April 20th of this year as well for adoption. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation. Lori and Chris and I are here. We'll be happy to, answer any questions that y'all might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any questions or comments from members of the commission? Commissioner Fider.
Thank you, Rick, for the presentation. Do you guys have an estimated time on when we'd see a draft of the proposed amendment? Or are we to be continued until?
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, an actual draft of the proposed amendment is available online on the planning's website. We wanted the opportunity, rather, to present the draft to you this evening to allow the stakeholder outreach to continue so they may view it, provide comments to us, but if you would like, you can view it online, currently on our website.
Commissioner Hutchinson.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I could see your point on so many different departments of the city being involved in such a discussion. How much pushback or how much feedback do you receive from the brick and mortar businesses and how they're impacted on, say, a food truck of similar circumstance setting up shop right next door? And you guys hear a lot about that, or is?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Hutchinson, it's a great question. Part of what the council subcommittee provided as council members themselves, they're hearing from their constituents. There has been some feedback from the brick and mortars with regard to their concerns. We've also had that same conversation on the economic development staff side, weighing both sides, both from what they're hearing from operators and both what they're hearing from restaurants. And so that's where staff's charge was to provide a draft code that balanced both of those needs, because we want to respect the business community, provide those opportunities, and to do so in a reasonable and prudent manner. And so what our task is right now, while our current regulations are very limited, we think the code that we're going to be proposing to Commission for formal consideration does provide that balance for the stakeholders.
Can I ask one more question, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Just kind of follow up on that too, and it seems like a silly question to ask, but how are taxes collected from food trucks, and where, like, they're in multiple jurisdictions, multiple municipalities, maybe in a single day, do they pay taxes to the cities that they do business in?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Hutchinson, I'm going to provide an answer, and where I may go off stray, I'm going to ask Chris to kind of jump in on this one. So each of our mobile food vendors does operate with a Peoria business license. In that, they do make an assessment to how much tax is collected within the city. That is then provided back to the city once that's recorded to the state. Chris, would you like to kind of add to that?
No, I think you cover it. That's my understanding as well.
Commissioner Nelson.
Thank you, Chair. Sean caught a couple of my questions, but I have one remaining, and that is, I'm confused about food trucks in residential areas. So if somebody had a birthday party or a graduation or a bar mitzvah and they want to bring a food truck in, as I understand it, right now they cannot and they wouldn't be allowed to under the ordinance that will be coming before us?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Nelson, that is a great question. There's a difference in when a food truck operates at a private event on someone's residential property. They're not servicing to the general public. They are there to be invited on the residence itself. And so therefore, it would be exempt from the food truck ordinance that we
I
would
see.
be proposing.
I gotcha. Okay, thank you for that. And let me ask just one more, if I may, Chair. The February 23rd meeting, if one of us on the commission had interest in attending that, do you foresee any issue with that?
Commissioner
Or is this
Nelson,
really-
no. In fact, if you would like to listen to it and observe, the only thing that I would suggest is if there is a possibility that more than 4 commissioners would be in attendance, we do have to notify for open meeting law. So if one of you would like to attend, please let us know so that we can make the appropriate posting on there.
Okay, great, thank you.
Commissioner Feider?
Just to follow up on Commissioner Hutchinson's comment as it relates to existing restaurants in brick and mortar traditional properties. Rick, you did talk about property owner approval as part of the thing. I think that's really important, is someone that oversees a lot of retail properties. We have a lot of food trucks trying to use our parking lots for those types of facilities, and we have to be very cognizant to protect our existing tenants that frankly have had a huge investment into that property. So it sounds like you guys are on it. I just wanted to reiterate that I think that's really important.
Chairman, Commissioner Feider, yeah, it's a critical component of the ordinance. And you know, the other thing I would state is I don't believe that we have an application that we process, you know, from a planning standpoint that doesn't require owner authorization. You know, so it just makes common sense that, you know, any type of operation that's going on a, you know, private piece of land would have that owner's authorization. You know, there's no other application you can process in the city without it. You know, so it just makes good sense that this would require that as well. And I would just point out, sir, that that was the only aspect across the board through the city or through the valley that everybody required.
Thank you. Commissioner Grace.
So just to follow up on that a little, let's say that there's a food truck on his property. He doesn't want him there. How does he call to get that enforced? Is he calling the police, calling the building code? I mean, building enforcement, how does that work?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Grice, it's a great question. Code enforcement would be able to call code enforcement. They would go out, ask if they have written permission, and it does need to be written permission provided so that the food truck operator can display that written permission at the time. If they do not have that permission, they would be asked to leave. Politely, yes.
Commissioner Nelson?
Apologies, I had one more question. Thank you for involving the Economic Development Department. As far as representation from brick and mortar, is the Peoria Chamber involved in this as far as reviewing? And if so, have they provided any feedback?
Commissioner Nelson, wonderful question. As part of the outreach process that we've provided, we allowed economic development to do kind of a mass update, which includes chamber and other community business owners as part of their business briefs and normal newsletter that they send out. So if they had an interest and they signed up, they received information through those newsletters and through the city's website if they've kept up to date with it.
You're referring to the chamber members themselves, if they have feedback? Has the
Or
chamber?
or the organization, sir.
Or is the organization?
Yeah.
So has the, maybe I'm not hearing it, did the organization take a position on, as far as what they want and don't want?
Commissioner Nelson, we have not received a formal
Okay, okay.
positioning statement. And so if we do receive any correspondence with that regard, that is part of what we will bring back into commission's packet when we formally present that.
Gotcha, okay. Thank you, Ms. Deaver.
Commissioner Waitman.
So my question is, how are we going to assure that these time limits are going to be enforced on private property? So let's say a private property owner gives permission, and they say, I don't mind if you stay here for 3 days. How do we assure that on private property?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Waitman, that's a great question. In fact, if you know, that was some of the guidance that was provided by the City Council Subcommittee was that we should look at a duration. They were thinking 6 hours, which is what the model code proposed. And that's essentially to distinguish a true mobile food vendor from a operation that's there all day long. So with your question about enforcement, anytime we write an ordinance, we want to be able to enforce it. And you're right, somebody's not going to be out there, you know, looking at their watch and watching them all day. But what I can tell you is that if we get complaints, because we're basically complaints-based, if we get complaints or if we noticed a food vendor seems to be hanging out there all day long at the same site, then at that point, we'll follow up and then really track the time more specifically, and then if we need to, work through enforcement action. But it provides a framework, if you will, for them to go by.
Thank you.
Commissioner Schaefer.
Thank you, Chair. Great presentation, Mr. Williams. My question is really around the temporary use permit. My understanding, according to the presentation, is there's a max of 30 days, and it can be renewed 3 times in 1 year, so 90 days. Is there a limit on the amount of temporary use permits that they could apply for in a year?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Schaefer, yes, there is a time limit, and that was part of the discussion. If Rick, can you move back to the duration limit? So it's, I'd like to read off the slide momentarily. Okay, it's for 30 days. It can be renewed 3 times, up to 90 days per site. So that 30 days, so it can be a consecutive, or there could be a break in between, but the key is up to 30 days for 1 TUP, 3 times a year. There is a fee associated with that TUP process and a review time frame. So in order to have 90 days, they would need to file 3 temporary use permits with the city, 3 times the normal fee.
Thank you, Ms. Stevens.
And if I might add to that, I mean, this is one of the provisions that really made it problematic for food trucks, because they might want to be at a site for a few hours at a time, but they might want to do that for the entire year and not just be, you know, limited to 3 periods over a year.
So to expand on that, so if there's a location that they want to be at multiple times for multiple different events for, you know, different days throughout the year, they would have to apply for a temporary use every time that they use that site outside that 30-day window. Is that correct? Or every time they use it?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Schaefer, they would apply for a TUP, which then starts the clock, and they get a 30-day period, so they could be there as many times during that 30-day period. Then they only have 2 more opportunities to renew it over the year.
Thank you.
Commissioner Grice.
Would that mean then, like if I'm at a construction site and the food truck comes by for a month, and then I don't get to eat, and then maybe somebody else will come? I mean, is that kind of what would happen under this scenario now?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Grice, great question, and I think what we're trying to do is provide that type of flexibility where you have a food truck that wants to come to a construction site and then maybe they're gone in an hour or so. They wouldn't have to get a TUP. They would, if they're under that 6-hour period, they're behaving, they're acting like a food truck as the state statute sees it, and you wouldn't be required to have that TUP, just a business license.
Well, that's a very important distinction that I missed, that the 6-hour time frame is treated differently than if it's just 45 minutes, half an hour.
Right.
So that makes a lot more sense.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions myself. And on the most recent comment, just a clarification. So the TUP only applies if they are wanting to stay in one location for more than 6 hours consecutively.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, and you'll see the ordinance really soon, but as it's envisioned, that's correct. So the idea is that if you're a food truck and you're there under 6 hours at a site, you're still movable, you're still moving around and you're not at a fixed location. But we think if you're over there over 6 hours, you're there most of the day, most of the work period. And at that point, you're really operating differently than a food truck or food vendor. So we would require a TUP for that.
Sure, I understood. I shared a similar concern when I used to work in the office. There was a truck there every day outside of the APS campus, and certainly they were there maybe 2 hours, but they were there every day, and people counted on that. And I certainly would want to have that availability here. Follow up to the TUP question. So House Bill 2371, does that, it sounded like you were saying it prohibited the city from treating the food trucks differently than a restaurant. Does the TUP fit within the constraints of that House bill?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, what that House bill said is that it prohibited cities from treating food trucks differently than similar enterprises, not from restaurants, but similar enterprises like other mobile vendors, mobile retailer vendor or other types of temporary uses. We had to treat them similarly.
Okay, like the fire trucks and the Trump truck on Lake Pleasant Parkway, all those guys.
Correct, yep.
Okay. All right, just a couple more from me. Follow from Commissioner Nelson's comment about somebody being invited to, say, a private event at my home. There's no issue with them being on the public street, correct? There's no room at my house for them to park their truck anywhere but the street.
Mr. Chair, commissioners, that is correct. As Lori indicated earlier, they would be really exempt from this provision. They're more of a private event. They would still have to observe, of course, all traffic laws on that street.
Okay. Sorry, I had one more comment, and I'm going through my notes here. The League of Cities, it sounds like they drafted like a proposed ordinance. Are we, I guess maybe I should preface this with, I want to make sure we are applying regulation evenly towards Glendale or Phoenix or Surprise, so that it's really easy for the trucks to go from one city to the other. Are we applying those evenly with our neighbors?
Mr. Chair, commissioners, what the League of Cities did was compile best practices, and they put together a model ordinance, and they offered it to jurisdictions. Now, jurisdictions can choose which provisions they want to implement as part of their local ordinance, provided it's still in line with the state statute. And so, in that regard, we presented the model ordinance to our council subcommittee. There were some provisions of that they thought were that made a lot of sense, and that we are proposing as part of our ordinance. One of those things, of course, was a 6-hour duration. That was something that the model ordinance proposed, and thought made a lot of sense.
I would be interested when maybe we don't have the information yet, but before we go to approve something, to see, here's what our neighbors are doing, here's what we're doing different. I'm not saying I wouldn't want any differences, but at least understand how we're differing from our neighbors. They may not even be this far down the road. I don't know if that's something that you guys can even prepare.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, what we're always trying to do is keep our, Rick presented some benchmarking, and so we're always trying to keep that up to date to the extent that cities have updated their codes. But you got to remember, too, that each city is going to have their own interest and pinch points of things they're trying to address. And we're trying to balance the needs of the brick and mortar operations with the residents and making sure we're keeping that healthy balance. And so, other jurisdictions might have different priorities in their communities.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from any commissioners? This is a study session. I don't even know, do we open up to public, or does that conclude our study session?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, you would just entertain any questions you have for the commission, and there's no action tonight on this item.
Okay. If there are no other questions, we'll proceed to item 3R, recreational marijuana, Prop 207 text amendment. Staff, please give your presentation.
And this is my item. So item 3R that we're going to talk about tonight, this pertains to Proposition 207. This was termed the Smart and Safe Arizona Act, or as we probably all know it by, recreational marijuana. This was passed by Arizona voters at the November 3rd general election and was certified by the Secretary of State in late November. So it's in effect now. Overall, when you look up across the country, 15 states rather have legalized recreational marijuana, and 35 states have a medical marijuana form that they've approved. So on January 21st, we had a study session on this topic. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to provide, you're probably going to hear some of that information again as a refresher, but I've provided a copy of that presentation in your packet, so it's near the back of your packet. And we'll go through that. I'll go through the different elements of it. We'll talk about what the law provides us to do, what our current structure is in terms of medical marijuana, and then the proposed amendments. So when we get to the proposed amendments, if you have any questions, please stop me. If you want to refer to a provision, and we did put the ordinance in a legislative format, so feel free to refer to a line number, if you will, to just make it easier to follow. The good news is that I think we have a very good, sound starting point. The medical marijuana law was passed by voters back in 2010. We adopted a zoning code update in 2011. It's, I think, served us well. It's got a very sound structure. So what we're going to be proposing are really some housekeeping efforts, some targeted changes, and some other housekeeping efforts. But I think we start with a really good, sound footing to go from. Okay, let's revisit some of the highlights of Proposition 207. The new law legalizes the sale, possession, and use of recreational marijuana by adults over the age of 21. They can now possess up to 1 ounce of marijuana and no more than 5 grams in a concentrated form. Single adult households can also go up to 6 marijuana plants at their home. And if you happen to have 2 or more adults over the age of 21, you can go up to 12 marijuana plants in your household. The one proviso in the state statute is that any cultivation you do must be kept in a lockable, enclosed area, and it has to be beyond public view. The law also prohibits the use of recreational marijuana within a public place, and a public place is a defined term in state statute. It aligns with the Smoke-Free Arizona Act, and it includes all those types of uses that you can imagine that the general public is invited to go to, things like hotels and airports and restaurants, those types of places. Also prohibits the use of recreational marijuana on an open space. That's another defined term. And as you would imagine, that includes things like parks, preserves, sidewalks, any public facility, that all falls under the realm of open space. Now, one thing I mentioned at the study session is we've conducted a few study sessions with the City Council. They had one back on November 10. The November 10 study session really dealt with the use and possession of marijuana, which is beyond the realm of zoning, beyond our discussion tonight. But at that meeting, later on that evening, they did clarify the term open space and public place. Even though it was in the state statute, they wanted to clarify that open space also meant any property that's controlled, owned, or operated by the city of Peoria. That would also be within the definition of open space. Also, I mentioned at the study session that the sales of recreational marijuana, in addition to the local sales tax, the state does put a 16% tax on recreational marijuana sales. And if you remember that graphic, the revenue that's collected from the sale of recreational marijuana goes into the Smart and Safe Arizona Fund, and then it's then sent out to, it's divided into different categories, and it includes police and fire departments. There's a Justice Reinvestment Fund, so there's a Highway User Revenue Fund, so it goes into different categories that have some, I should say, some nexus with recreational marijuana implementation or use. The state statute also now includes the testing of marijuana. So Prop 207 now includes the licensing of marijuana testing facilities. I think I mentioned last time that even though we've had a medical marijuana statute in place for 10 years, we were one of the few states that did not require testing of marijuana. We do now. That's now embedded in state law. It's part of Prop 207. But it does require that all marijuana product be tested for potency and contamination prior to its sales. So one of the things now we'll see are these marijuana testing facilities. Marijuana testing facilities, they also come under the licensing, and their employees are regulated by the Arizona Department of Health Services, and with the proviso that the siting of these facilities is subject to local zoning regulations. So that's one of the things I'll talk to you tonight is about our proposal and how we address marijuana testing facilities. Now, there are only 2 testing facilities right now in the valley. One of those is located in the Scottsdale Air Park in a, I would describe it as a, well, you can see it on the screen. It's the picture on the top. Kind of a nondescript building. It's really in a business park, industrial type of environment. The picture on the bottom, that is in a little north of downtown Phoenix. That's also in what I would describe as a business park type of environment. But there are 2 that are currently in the valley. I imagine with this new requirement, we're going to see a lot more that will come to fruition. And like the Medical Marijuana Act, the Arizona Department of Health Services, they are assigned the responsibility for regulating the licensing and administration of marijuana facilities and their agents. So one of the things that the Prop 207 did is it gave them a very short amount of time frame to develop rules that they would use to regulate these aspects. They quickly drafted some rules. They were largely based on the rules they had for medical marijuana. They released those out to the public. There was some public comment on that, and they've adopted those rules January 15th, 2021. The proposition also provides for early applications from existing medical marijuana establishments in good standing. So this initial period is now in place. They've started to accept applications as of January 19th, and they have through March 9 for this initial period. I think you might note they've already issued some of those applications. In fact, in Peoria, there are 2 facilities that I'm aware of that already has a recreational component in place. I believe the one at Olive and 91st, what is it called? I'm trying to remember the name of that place. Bloom, that's right. And then the place at Peoria at 91st near the Home Depot, they do have a recreational component as part of their dispensary. So those are operating now. After this period, the ADHS is going to open it up to randomly to qualified applicants in a random notion. 26 of the licenses have to be reserved for social equity applicants. And so I talked about that a little bit last time, but the way the proposition identifies those, and this is the language from the proposition, but they are applicants that come from communities disproportionately impacted by the enforcement of previous marijuana laws. So the proposition doesn't define how the state would identify those applicants, but in looking at other states that have a very similar provision, they're essentially applicants that might be from lower income communities or areas with a higher ratio of marijuana arrests and convictions. That's the way that many other states that have a similar provision have operated. So we'll see how those rules come out. I mentioned that the rules were adopted on January 15th. They have not yet adopted the rules for social equity applicants. I believe they have until June 1st of 2021 to have all their final rules in place for the social equity applicants. The other provision is that home delivery is not currently permitted, is currently prohibited rather under the proposition until rules are developed, and the rules can't be developed any sooner than 2023. So that's the soonest that the state can look at new rules, and they would have until 2025 to develop those rules for home delivery. I should mention that really it's kind of a moot point in Peoria. As I go through our existing ordinance, we don't currently permit any home delivery of marijuana except to a medical marijuana facility, but no home delivery that we permit. So the Department of Health Services, I mentioned, they will also be issuing licenses for, or they have started, for marijuana establishments and testing facilities. These are licensed separately from the medical marijuana facilities. So we have separate licensing regimes there. Like medical marijuana, the number of licenses is limited, and it's also the same ratio. It's 1 per every 10 pharmacies. Pharmacies are registered and they obtain a permit from the Arizona Board of Pharmacies through the state. The state has about 120 medical marijuana dispensaries statewide. It is projected that approximately 160 total marijuana establishments will be statewide. The majority of these are anticipated to be dual facilities. So you have a nonprofit side and you have a recreational side of it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, at least 26 of those licenses have to be reserved for the social equity applicants. All right, now we'll get into land use and zoning, really the realm that we're going to be talking about tonight. Proposition 207 does preserve local zoning authority, so like with a food truck, I'll talk about things that the city has the ability to enact through the zoning code and things that we are restricted from enacting. We can limit where marijuana facilities are located and the process by which they can be considered, so we can relegate them to certain areas. If we wanted to limit or have a cap on the total number of marijuana facilities in the city, we certainly could do that as well. We could also outright prohibit marijuana retail and testing facilities in the city. The only exception is that you'll see we can't treat them any differently than medical marijuana facilities. So if we already permit medical marijuana facilities or already have facilities in the city, we have to allow the retail establishments at least as a dual licensee. So in that exact example, we could not outright prohibit them. We can also regulate the time, place, and manner of the facilities. So we can limit the hours. We already do limit the hours. We can require a security plan. We can have limits on drive-through facilities. And so when I go through existing ordinance, I'll remind you of some of those limitations that we already have in place. We can also institute reasonable restrictions on signage. That is provided in the bill. We can, in our current ordinances I'll mention in a minute, we just allow the name of the establishment to be on the sign. We don't allow for any symbolization of the product or service that's offered on site. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we can restrict home delivery of marijuana or outright prohibit it. All right, so what are we restricted from doing? We cannot have regulations that are more restrictive than the regulations we have for medical marijuana dispensaries. So essentially, we have to treat them similarly. Also, we can't have regulations that have the effect of unduly burdening the operation. So whereas we might say that we allow retail establishments if the regulations are so onerous that effectively does not allow them and we treat them differently than medical marijuana, that can be problematic. I mentioned last time that we can't prohibit them from transporting marijuana on public roads. That just isn't feasible when you think about it. And probably the most important aspect of this to remember is that we cannot restrict a existing medical marijuana dispensary from being a dual licensee. And as I mentioned, we already have a couple in the city that are dual licensees. So they do have the ability to operate both sides of the house at a shared facility. So we'll have to keep that in mind. Okay, I want to briefly talk about the structure that we have in place. I talked about it a little bit last time, but I mentioned that I think we have a very good structure in place, but just to remind the commission where we are today, how do we treat medical marijuana dispensaries? So back in 2011, when we devised our ordinance, we noticed that it was still illegal in many states. It's a cash-based business, still illegal at the federal level like it is today. And we thought it made sense that as a cash-based business, in talking with our police department and other departments, that it made sense that we relegate them to commercial zoning districts along heavily traveled roadways. That way they're always visible, they're not in backlot locations, and so we thought that was important. So we required a conditional use permit. That, of course, is a process whereby we can look at the specific attributes of the operation. The public's invited to participate in that process, and it comes to the commission. You ultimately have the the obligation to make a decision on those conditional use permits. We also have separation requirements, and these are very common when you look at cities across the valley. They all have some type of separation requirement. We do require that they be at least 2640, which is a half mile from other dispensaries or cultivation sites. We require there to be 1,000 feet from things you can see on the screen, schools, bars, liquor stores, and so forth, and 500 feet from residential zoning districts. Sometimes we get the question, well, why not also have a separation requirement from parks, because we do see families and kids at parks. And the reason for that is, if you remember, we can't have this was a proposition that was passed by the citizens, and you can't effectively have an ordinance that is so onerous that it negates any qualifying location for it. So I think when we ran the mapping at that time, right now we probably have a handful of qualifying sites for medical marijuana dispensaries. If we would have added in all the parks, we came to the conclusion that there would have been no qualifying location. So that's the reason why the parks was not part of that. We also require a security plan that's approved by the police department. In that provision, they have to have cameras on site. They have to retain recordings for at least 60 days. They have to have an alarm system that monitors. And we also require a security guard to be present during business operations. We also require the product to be behind a locked counter. And so when somebody comes in, they have to be invited to the back to look at the product from a licensed dispensary agent. We also have restrictions on the operating hours. I mentioned the signage earlier, and waste disposal, meaning they can't dispose of any residue through the normal trash. They have to treat them essentially like medical waste. So there has to be a separate plan and separate provisions for waste disposal. And then to discourage any loitering or any those types of scenes, we don't allow any outdoor seating around these dispensaries, and we don't allow any drive-through or delivery services. So those are the provisions we have right now for medical marijuana dispensaries. Marijuana cultivation facilities, very similar, I should say, almost the same operating limitations. The one thing is that these were limited or relegated rather to business park industrial and other industrial zoning locations. The way they operate, the way they behave, they have that feeling more of an industrial type of feel to it. So we relegate them to those locations. And again, as I mentioned, we don't have any current facilities in the city of Peoria. Okay, Lori mentioned that, kind of talked about how we get city council direction. I mentioned that we've had 2 study sessions with the city council. The first one on November 10th, that was really around use and possession. We had a second study session on January 5th, 2021, and that was really to talk about land use and zoning and get their feedback on kind of the big policy perspective on how we should address our new code requirements pertaining to recreational marijuana. So one of the things that came up is that they all believed that we had a very good structure in place. They were very happy with kind of the way things have run over the last decade. We had input from the police department that they haven't been problematic, that in fact, the information I got from the police department, we had them run the crime numbers for the last 5 years. And the information I got from them was that there was no significant events or major crimes reported during this time frame. So our ordinance seemed to be working well. The structure seemed to be working well. Our council acknowledged that. Some of the concerns they did have was, as we grow as a city, they had concerns about proliferation of dispensaries. And they also wanted to ensure that recreational sales occurred in a dual facility. They didn't want standalone recreational marijuana facilities. So one of the things they did direct staff to do was to come back to them at the next council meeting after that with an ordinance that addressed specifically the provision to require that, rather to prohibit recreational marijuana sales unless they're part of a dual facility, so you have both sides of the house. That was taken to the council on January 19th, and they adopted that ordinance. So we do have that in place now. We don't allow recreational sales unless it's part of a dual facility. The other thing we talked about and we got direction from the council was the idea of these marijuana testing facilities. They didn't feel that it was necessary to have a ban or a prohibition against these facilities, and they thought that they were appropriate to be treated similarly to, or be relegated rather to also industrial districts and treated similarly to the cultivation facilities. So, subject to the same limitations that we have for those facilities. Okay, so that gets into the proposed changes, and again, what I'll refer to as I go through this section. I'm going to talk about the highlights for the different sections that we're looking to modify, but we've got the entire code in Exhibit A, and it's in legislative format, so we've tried to identify additions and deletions to the code as a result of this. The first place I'll start is definitions, and we looked at the state statute. The state statute, the proposition, they provide a lot of definitions that we just simply brought forward into our code. So we've updated and added definitions to align with the statute. We have a new definition for what does it mean to cultivate and cultivation of marijuana. It means to propagate, breed, grow, prepare, and package marijuana. We have a new definition for marijuana manufacturing, so that you can see on the screen that includes blending, extracting, and otherwise preparing a marijuana product. Also, we also adopted the definition of marijuana testing facility. So it's important to note that this is an entity that's licensed by the state of Arizona. They have the obligation to analyze the potency of marijuana and test marijuana for harmful contaminants. So these terms you'll see in the code, those are from the state statute. We also have a new definition for dual licensee, because we do use that in our code. You can read that in the screen, but that's also from the state statute as well. And again, it's an entity that holds both licenses, both sides of the house. We have a new definition, and this is not from the state statute, but it blends portions of the state statute. Whereas we used to call them medical marijuana dispensaries, we're proposing now the more broad, dual licensed term of qualifying marijuana dispensary. So that essentially is a term that recognizes that, the policy direction that the council provided is for a dual licensee. So there are two components of a qualifying marijuana dispensary. A qualifying marijuana dispensary includes the nonprofit side of the house. So somebody can come in and just provide nonprofit medical dispensary, that we would call them a qualified dispensary, or they can be a dual licensing marijuana dispensary. And those are facilities that operate as a dual licensee for medical or general use sales. Okay, the next section I'm proposing a change to, this is the land use matrix, and this is in the non-residential section of our zoning code. So this is a matrix that applies to all commercial and industrial zoning districts. And if you look at the land use matrix, it tells you what types of land uses are permitted or not permitted, or if they're permitted with a conditional use permit. So we've added a new use, the marijuana testing facility. As we looked at the best location for these facilities, and we talked to our council about that, we noticed that the closest use that we found was research laboratories. Right now, we allow research laboratories in all of our business park industrial districts. Council felt that made sense, and so with the new use, we proposed to be a conditional use permit in the business park industrial districts. And all of those operating limitations that I showed you earlier for cultivation facilities, that would also apply for testing facilities as well. And then we've also reformulated the use listing for qualifying marijuana dispensaries. So again, we're combining the nonprofit side with the retail side as a dual licensee. There's no change to the zoning. So they still are relegated to all those commercial zoning districts that I mentioned. They still require a conditional use permit. And all of those operating limitations would still apply to these joint facilities. The next part was to the operating limitations, section 21505. And so these are all of the parameters that the council felt were prudent. And so there was no proposed change to these limitations. Now you'll see some housekeeping changes into them. We're broadening them from medical to more of marijuana establishments generally. One thing that is new that I do want to talk about is the third bullet point there. New language recognizing that PADs, which are planned area developments, and PCDs, planned community developments, are distinct zoning districts. So let me describe this one for you. I mean, I think the commission sees a lot of rezone cases, and oftentimes they are PADs or PCDs. What those are distinct zoning districts. We have the opportunity to tailor standards to match the context for an area or a specific development program, but they are distinct zoning districts, if you will. So right now we have a construct where we say, okay, dispensaries can go in C2, C4, and C5 zoning districts, right? But we have PADs. When you look at the use schedule, it might say, okay, the uses that we allow in this PAD are any use that we allow in the C2 zoning district. So somebody could infer or could challenge the city and say, well, because this PAD says that any uses in the C2 district are permitted, and I meet all your separation requirements, why couldn't I have a dispensary in this PAD? So the city and the council wanted to make sure that we all recognize that PADs and PCDs are separate and distinct. So to have a dispensary, you have to be in a qualifying location in those 3 commercial zoning districts. And if you wanted to propose a dispensary in a qualifying location within a PAD or PCD, well, you got to go through the public process, right? And the public has the opportunity to participate in that process and decide if, with the commission and council, decide if it's a prudent location for that facility. So that's something that's new in the code. Okay, the qualifying marijuana dispensaries, this just notes that they have to be at a shared location. Again, there aren't any changes to the operating limitations with one exception, and that's the hours of operation. So currently, dispensaries can operate from 8 to 9 p.m. And so one of the changes that we're recommending is that the hours go from 7 to 10. Now, why is that change being done? It aligns with the Department of Health Services. They have their administrative rules in place, and so they recognize that dispensaries have to operate as they're licensed so many hours, and they're open between those hours. So we want to align it with the administrative rules that are in place. With respect to marijuana cultivation, manufacturing, and testing, there aren't any changes to any of the operating limitations. We're just adding the marijuana testing facilities and removing the medical part of it because these are general cultivation facilities now. All right, in the last section of the code, completely different section, deals with home occupations. So the zoning code does permit, as you would imagine, certain types of limited home occupations in residential districts. The idea behind that is that we allow some limited businesses to occur in our single-family neighborhoods, but we want to make sure that they occur in a manner that person walking down the street, a neighbor, doesn't notice their existence, right? So that therefore we limit, we don't allow signage, we limit how many visitors the business can have at a time, because first and foremost, these are residential zoning districts. We want them to behave and feel like residential zoning districts. So there are some types of uses that are prohibited as home occupations. These are the types of uses that generate a lot of traffic that might be just incompatible in a residential setting. So the code already prohibits medical marijuana dispensing and cultivation as a home occupation. So in the code, it's just a clarification that also includes not just medical, but general dispensing and cultivation of marijuana. So I do want to make the distinction. So we're talking about a business that still, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't negate the opportunity for an individual in a private setting to grow 6 or 12 plants, whatever their household would enable them. This just applies to home occupations. And finally, tonight we are asking that you recommend approval of this case as we've proposed in Exhibit A. The findings, we believe that the amendment is responsive to Prop 207. We have some targeted changes to the regulatory structure. We believe that the land use structure we've had in place for the last 11 years has served the city well. It does provide for a reasonable number of locations for those that are seeking marijuana for recreational or medical reasons. It does protect the public health, safety, and welfare, and we've also provided changes for the clarity, and we believe it does, and it is consistent with our goals and policies in our general plan. So I know there's a lot there to unpack, and I'm here if you have any questions.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Do any commissioners have any questions or comments? Commissioner Schaefer.
Chris, thank you for that overview. I have a clarifying question. In the separation requirements, the 2,600 feet, the half mile from another dispensary facility, I assume that we're talking about bricks and sticks, because if we're operating dual license with medical and recreational, would that be contraindicated according to that? So are we, in regards to separation requirement, 2,640 feet, is that bricks and sticks, not business licenses?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, good question. It is from the bricks and sticks, so we measure it from the exterior part of the wall of the building or the premise housing that use. So when we talk about also a dual facility, I think we talked last time, you couldn't have a strip mall, for example, and one end of the suite be the medical side, the other be they have to be in the same location, physical location.
Thank you, Chris.
There was another commissioner that disappeared. Commissioner Waitman?
So my question is, I just want to clarify, I think that you touched on this and you said if there are 2 tenants in a household, they can grow up to 12 plants. So we're talking about 6 per person. So let's say we have 6 people living in a home, could be an estate, could be a mansion. Is there a specific number that the city would not want to exceed?
Mr. Chair, commissioners, this provision comes out of the proposition that's now embedded in state law, and what it says is it provides a ceiling of 12 plants. If you have 2 or more adults over the age of 21, you can go up to 12 plants. So if you have 10 adults there, it's still 12 plants.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Commissioner Nelson?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. Interesting. The modifications look reasonable to me. I still find it interesting we don't cap number of bars, but we cap pretty restrictively the number of medical marijuana dispensaries, dual licensees here. Maybe we'll get to a point in time where we're not so conservative leaning in this city when it comes to this kind of thing. But that's a topic for another day. The question I had is, and it's kind of in that regard, we have, correct me if I'm wrong, we have 4 dispensaries currently, 1 approved but not built, and then an additional site that are no plans. Do we have 6 qualifying sites? I'm trying to remember the last conversation.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, we have 4 operating medical marijuana dispensaries now, and we have a 5th site that on Thunderbird that the commission granted a conditional use permit for it.
Right.
They have not executed it, meaning they haven't gotten site plan approval or a building permit, but I believe that is forthcoming because there have been some recent discussions about that. The conditional use permit is only good for, I believe, 18 months. They have to execute that.
So at the way things stand now, we could have no more than 6 dual licensees within the city of Peoria.
Mr. Chair, commissioners, so we have 4 or 5 now. When we ran the mapping, we had a handful of sites. I want to say 6, 7 qualifying sites or so throughout the city. But we also have to remember too that when we're thinking about the city of Peoria, there are sites that are on our border. I can tell you that there's one at 83rd and Union Hills in Glendale, but right adjacent to our boundary. There's also one at Bell Road and 99th in Sun City, really close to our boundary. There's also one at Grand Avenue, just west of our boundary in Sun City. So there are some facilities that still serve Peoria residents that are proximate to us.
Interesting. And are the social equity licenses in addition to those, or is that part? Tell me how that, I'm not sure I understand how that dovetails into the qualifying sites.
Yep, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, good question. So if you recall, there's a limit on how many total licenses the state can grant for marijuana establishments. It's a ratio. And of those total number, 26 of those have to be reserved for social equity applicants. So let's say a social equity applicant gets a license, they're still, and they want to operate a dispensary, they still have to meet our local land use requirements.
And as we annex and grow, will we have more qualifying sites, or are we kind of locked in by the definition of the statute to 6?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, as we annex more sites, if those sites have the zoning that enables them to have a dispensary meet the separation requirements, we could have additional ones. Or, as I mentioned earlier, if there is a site that is well outside all those separation, that's within a PAD or PCD, because we've got a lot of them, they certainly could petition the city council to include that as part of their PAD, go through a public process.
Oh, I see. I gotcha. Okay. All right. Thank you, Chris.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Commissioner Hutchinson?
Thanks, Chair. Commissioner Nelson took a couple of my questions I had thought about. I'm curious, is there any associations growing out of this industry? I know it's becoming very, very mainstream. It's publicly traded on a couple of, on a couple of levels, and I know it's starting to become a really established industry, and I'm just wondering if there's any associations that are weighing in and providing input to this process.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, good question. There are certainly associations out there. The industry is certainly, they're certainly dialed into this process. The one thing about this is with Prop 207, it provided for a very accelerated timeframe, meaning that the Department of Health Services had to have rules in place very quickly. They had to start issuing licenses very quickly, and it was important that the city have rules in place at a time frame prior to licenses being issued on a wider scale. So we had a very accelerated time frame. We have been quite a bit in the newspaper. We have a couple study sessions with the council and then one with the Planning Commission. We have put the ordinance out there for comment. We haven't got any specific comment yet, but I'll note that, as you probably noticed with the presentation, largely our structure remains intact. There are some substantive changes, but we're not looking at wholesale changes from what we've had in place. So I think those existing dispensaries, they're knowledgeable about what our code provides for and what changes we provide for. And as you can see, some of them are seeking that dual license.
I think I share the fellow commissioners' concerns about taking such a conservative approach to this. I think it's a real opportunity, and I guess it's going to just take some time to, shake the stigma and move forward, because this is a real opportunity for the city, I think. So, but thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments or questions from the commission? With that, I will open up the public hearing. Do we have any requests for speakers? No. Nope. Does anybody from the public wish to address the commission? Nope. All right, we will close. And last chance, any comments, questions from the commission? Commissioners, do we have a motion?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move to recommend approval for case TA 21-01 as provided in Exhibit A.
A second.
Thank you. Commissioners, vote. Thank you. I believe that is our last regular agenda item. Do we have any, excuse me, we have a call to the public for any non-agenda items. Don't believe we do. Do we have any reports from staff?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, just a couple of items. First off, I wanted to thank and welcome the new members to the commission. It's refreshing to see a full commission now, and great discussion tonight. I think this is going to be a great commission going forward, certainly. Upcoming meeting dates, we have March 4 and March 18. I do want to note for you on the March 4 location, just kind of give you an update. You might recall back in October we had a case. It was essentially a Taco Bell was looking to go into Thunderbird. I can't talk anything about the case today because it's not agenda size, but it did go to council, and there was some new information that they remanded that item back to the commission to take another look at the case relative to this new information. So you'll see that on the next agenda. And we also have a stipulation modification for what used to be the Pure Regional Medical Center on North Lake Pleasant Parkway. That was the structure that was up there for many years was an eyesore that finally came down. So we're working with a new developer on that project, and there's a stipulation modification we'll see. So we'll see at our next March 4 date, and that's all I had this evening.
Thank you. Any commission updates? With none, see no further business, I adjourn this meeting. Thank you.